A veteran lives in seclusion to escape his past. His loyal dog suddenly shatters their ironclad routine, leading him to a place he has never been. There, washed upon the sand, is something impossible: a Vietnamese basket boat. Inside lies not just the mystery of its journey across the ocean, but a hidden confession, a message that will force the veteran to confront the most terrifying memory of his life. Please support us by subscribing to the channel. The floorboards were cold. That was the first thing Jacob felt every morning, a deep, invasive cold that seeped through the soles of his feet and seemed to climb straight into his bones. It was the Oregon coast's version of a welcome, a damp, persistent chill that the old cabin's wood stove could push back, but never truly defeat. It was 5:30, and the world outside was a formless dark, a canvas of gray on gray, where the sea and sky bled into one. He moved through the pre-dawn gloom with a practiced economy of motion, his footsteps silent on the worn wood. There was a discipline to his life, a rigid structure that had been his only anchor for more years than he cared to count. Jacob was a man built of sharp angles and quiet resilience. In his late 50s, he was tall and lean, the kind of wiry strength that comes not from gyms, but from a life of purpose, even if that purpose had long since faded. His brown hair, cut short and neat, was heavily salted with silver at the temples. His face was a landscape carved by time and hardship, lined and austere, but his eyes, a soft, weary blue, held a kindness that he rarely allowed anyone to see. This morning, he wore a thick gray thermal shirt and faded denim jeans, the unofficial uniform of his self-imposed exile. At the slight creak of the floor, a large shape stirred from a rug by the hearth. A pair of intelligent golden eyes opened, followed by the soft thump of a tail against the floor. This was Shadow, a 7-year-old German shepherd whose coat was a rare, striking mix of silver gray and white, making him look almost spectral in the dim light. He was not a creature of frantic energy. His temperament was as steady and quiet as the ancient coastal forests. He rose silently, his movements fluid, and rested his great head on Jacob's thigh, his gaze unwavering. There was no need for words or commands. They understood each other in the profound silence they shared. The routine began. Coffee beans, measured precisely, went into the grinder. The machine's brief, violent roar was the only sound that dared to challenge the morning's quiet. Water was boiled, coffee was brewed, and 2 mugs were filled. One for him, black and strong. The other, filled with lukewarm water, was placed on the floor for Shadow. They took their morning measure together, man and dog, watching the first hint of bruised purple light appear on the horizon. Jacob's life was a fortress, built of these small, repeatable actions. Prepare coffee, check the woodpile, walk the beach, mend what was broken, eat, sleep, repeat. It was a defense mechanism, a series of fortified walls he had constructed around the crater in his memory, the one left behind by the heat and noise and confusion of a war fought in 1973. The routine kept the ghosts at bay. Most of the time, he pulled on a worn navy blue flannel shirt, its wool softened by countless washes, and laced up a pair of sturdy, waterproof boots. Shadow was already at the door, his tail giving a single, expectant wag. The air outside was thick with the scent of salt and damp pine. A heavy mist rolled in from the Pacific, shrouding the world and muffling all sound. The roar of the surf was reduced to a distant, rhythmic whisper. Their path was not a path at all, but a barely there trail Jacob had worn through the tough coastal grass, leading down a short, rocky bluff to the beach below. He never saw anyone else here. His cabin was nestled in a forgotten cove, miles from the nearest town, and he preferred it that way. The world and he had come to a quiet agreement decades ago. They would leave each other alone. The sand was cold and firm under his boots, a vast expanse of gray stretching out to meet the fog. Sea stacks, monolithic and dark, rose from the mist like ancient sentinels, guarding secrets he did not want to know. Jacob walked with his head slightly bowed, his gaze fixed on the space just ahead of his feet. He did not look at the horizon. The horizon was a place of endless questions, of what lay beyond, and he had long since decided he was done with questions. Shadow walked at his left heel, a silent gray phantom moving in perfect sync with his master. He didn't run ahead or chase the gulls that cried invisibly from within the fog. He was on duty. His job was to be present, to be a solid, living anchor in Jacob's drifting world. They walked for exactly 1 hour, a habit timed by the sun's imperceptible rise behind the wall of mist. The tide was low, exposing a shoreline littered with kelp and driftwood, the bleached bones of ancient trees tossed ashore by winter storms. The rhythm of it all, the crunch of his boots, the steady panting of his dog, the sigh of the waves, was a mantra meant to keep his mind blessedly empty. But the ocean did not always cooperate. Sometimes the rhythmic crash and drag of a powerful wave sounded, for a fleeting, sickening second, like something else. Not water on sand, but the deep, percussive thumping of helicopter blades spinning up in a humid dawn. The sound ambushed him. His breath hitched. The scent of salt was suddenly replaced by the phantom smell of jet fuel and damp, rotting jungle. The gray mist swirled, and for a moment it was not mist, but smoke, thick and acrid, clinging to his throat. His steps faltered. The decision, the order given, the image of a small boat made of woven reeds. It flashed behind his eyes, a half-second of pure, undiluted memory, as sharp and painful as the day it was forged. He stopped, his hand clenching into a fist at his side. He squeezed his eyes shut, forcing the image out, wrestling the memory back into its cage. Breathe in the salt. Breathe out the smoke. It's just the waves, he told himself. The same waves as yesterday. It's just the fog. A wet nose pressed insistently into his clenched fist. Shadow whined, a low, concerned sound deep in his chest. Jacob opened his eyes and looked down at his companion. The dog's golden gaze was fixed on his face, full of a deep, knowing empathy that asked for nothing but offered everything. Jacob's fist slowly uncurled, and he rested his hand on Shadow's head, his fingers sinking into the thick, soft fur. The solid, living warmth beneath his palm was his tether to the here and now. The phantom smell of smoke receded, replaced once more by the clean, cold scent of the sea. "I'm all right, boy," Jacob whispered, his voice rough from disuse. They stood there for a long moment, man and dog, two solitary figures against the immense, indifferent backdrop of the ocean. Then, as one, they turned and began the slow walk back to the cabin, back to the safety of the silent routine. The rest of the day would unfold as it always did. There was a fence post to replace, tools to be cleaned, a simple meal of soup and bread to be prepared. There would be no phone calls, no television, no news from the loud and complicated world that existed beyond his cove. There would only be the tasks at hand, the quiet companionship of his dog, and the ceaseless murmuring silence of the coast. It was a lonely life, a hollow one, but it was a life he could control. And for a man who had long ago lost control of everything that mattered, that was enough. Several days passed in their customary unbroken rhythm. The brief fissure in Jacob's composure on the beach had been sealed over by the powerful mortar of routine. Each morning was a precise replica of the one before it. The cold floor, the ritual of coffee, the silent walk along the gray, misty shore. Jacob found a strange comfort in this predictability. It was a world of his own making, with no surprises, no variables he could not control. The ocean could rage and the wind could howl, but within the walls of his cabin and the confines of his schedule, there was a measure of peace. On this particular morning, the fog was thicker than usual, a dense, wet blanket that pressed in on all sides. It swallowed sound, erased the horizon, and reduced the world to a small, isolated circle of sand and surf. As always, Jacob walked with his gaze lowered, while Shadow trotted faithfully at his heel, a steady presence in the disorienting haze. They were halfway through their route, approaching a familiar outcropping of basalt rock that marked their turning point, when the routine was broken. Shadow stopped. It was not a gradual slowing, but a sudden, rigid halt. Jacob, lost in his thoughts, took another 2 steps before he realized the familiar, soft padding beside him was gone. He turned. The German shepherd stood alert, his body tensed, his head cocked. His ears, usually relaxed, were pivoted forward, aimed at the wall of fog to their right, toward a section of the coast Jacob actively avoided. It was a treacherous jumble of sea stacks and jagged rocks, slick with green algae, where the tide could trap the unwary. A low whine rumbled in Shadow's chest. He looked back at Jacob, his golden eyes filled with an unmistakable urgency, and then looked toward the rocks again, taking a hesitant step in that direction. "No, boy," Jacob said, his voice quiet but firm. "This way." He gestured back toward their path. Shadow whined again, a more insistent sound this time. He took another step toward the rocks, then tugged gently but firmly at the leg of Jacob's jeans with his mouth. It was a behavior so unusual, so contrary to his disciplined nature, that it sent a prickle of unease up Jacob's spine. In all their years together, Shadow had never challenged their path. "What is it?" Jacob murmured, scanning the impenetrable fog. He could see nothing, hear nothing, but the ceaseless hush of the waves. He tried to pull Shadow back, but the dog resisted, planting his feet in the sand. His gaze was locked on the hidden shoreline, pleading. For a long moment, Jacob stood in conflict. Every instinct screamed at him to maintain the routine, to turn back to the safety of the known path. But the trust he had in this animal, a trust forged in years of shared silence and unwavering loyalty, was absolute. Shadow sensed something that he could not, and to ignore it felt like a betrayal. With a heavy sigh of resignation, he gave a slight nod. "All right, lead the way, but be careful." The dog's relief was palpable. He immediately set off, not with a reckless bound, but with a careful, deliberate pace, navigating the treacherous terrain with an intelligence that never ceased to amaze Jacob. They scrambled over slick, kelp-covered rocks and squeezed through a narrow passage between 2 towering pillars of basalt. The air here was still, the sound of the main surf muffled. It felt like entering a different world, a secret chamber of the coast. After several minutes of careful climbing, the passage opened into a small, secluded cove. It was a perfect crescent of sand, no more than 50 yards across, walled in on 3 sides by high, dark cliffs. The fog swirled here, thinner in some places, thicker in others. It was a place of profound isolation, a lost pocket of the world. And it was there, resting on the sand just above the tide line, that Jacob saw it. His breath caught in his throat. His heart gave a painful, violent lurch against his ribs. It was small and round, like a giant hollowed-out seed pod, and so utterly, jarringly out of place that for a moment his mind refused to process what he was seeing. It was a boat, but a kind of boat that had no business being on this side of the world, on this cold and windswept shore. It was woven from strips of bamboo, its hull coated in a thick black resin that gleamed dully in the flat, gray light. A Thuyen Thung, a basket boat. The name surfaced in his mind unbidden, a word in a language he had not heard or spoken in over 50 years. The sight of it was a physical blow. The world tilted, the cold Oregon air vanishing, replaced by a suffocating tropical humidity that clogged his lungs. The gentle hiss of the Pacific became the murky, sluggish current of a river in Quang Ngai province. He could smell the river mud, the scent of wood smoke and fermented fish sauce. He could feel the oppressive weight of the air, thick with unspoken fear. He staggered back a step, his hand flying to his chest as if to keep his heart from beating its way out. The images came in a flood, the ones he kept locked away behind the disciplined walls of his routine. A line of these small boats, carrying families, a shouted command, the glint of sunlight on water, the chatter of insects, the sudden, terrible noise, the chaos. He squeezed his eyes shut, but he could not shut out the memory. It was burned onto the back of his eyelids. When he opened them again, the boat was still there. It was not a phantom. It was real, solid, resting on the sand of his coast. And that was when the second wave hit him, not of memory, but of sheer, staggering disbelief. This was impossible. He was a man who understood the sea. He had lived on its edge for decades, had studied its moods, its tides, its powerful, indifferent currents. He knew about the great North Pacific gyre, the massive clockwise current that dominated the ocean. He knew about the California current that flowed south along this very coast. For a craft like this, fragile and rudderless, to survive a journey across thousands of miles of open ocean through storms and shipping lanes was unthinkable. And for it to navigate that impossible journey only to land here, in this one tiny hidden cove on the vast coastline of North America. The odds were not astronomical. They were fictional. Even if it had been launched from somewhere on the U.S. coast as a strange piece of art or a memorial, its chances of washing up here, intact, were infinitesimal. The ocean was a thing of chaos. It scattered, it destroyed. It did not deliver, not like this. The sheer logical absurdity of it was what cut through the fog of his panic. The boat's presence was a violation of the laws of nature as he understood them. It was a miracle or a message, and in his world there was no difference between the two. His instinct, his lifelong habit, was to turn and walk away, to retreat to his cabin, lock the door, and let the tide reclaim this ghost, erasing it from his shore and his memory. But he couldn't. The brutal shock of memory had been replaced by a powerful, unsettling curiosity. This impossible object, this relic from the deepest, most guarded part of his past, had found him. Against all odds, against all logic, it had crossed an ocean of time and water to land at his feet. It felt less like a random piece of debris and more like a summons, a piece of his own history demanding to be seen. Shadow, who had been watching him with quiet intensity, nudged his hand as if sensing the shift in his owner's turmoil. Jacob looked down at the dog, then back at the boat. The fear was still there, a cold knot in his stomach, but something else was there too. The unnerving feeling that this was not an accident. It was a piece of fate he could not ignore. Slowly, hesitantly, he took a step forward, his boots sinking into the soft sand. He was breaking his own most sacred rule. He was walking toward the past. The space between Jacob and the basket boat felt charged, a few yards of sand holding 50 years of silence. He stood frozen for a long moment, the mist curling around his ankles, his breath a white plume in the cold air. The instinct to retreat was a powerful current, pulling him back toward the safety of his cabin and the rigid order of his life. But the boat held a stronger gravity. It was an anchor thrown from the depths of his past, and it had snagged him fast. Beside him, Shadow remained utterly still, a silent gray sentinel watching his master's internal war. With a slow, deliberate exhale, Jacob closed the distance. Each step was heavy, as if he were wading through thick, viscous mud instead of sand. When he finally stood beside the craft, he reached out a hesitant, trembling hand and laid it flat against the hull. The surface was rough, a mix of hardened resin and the underlying texture of woven bamboo. It was cool and damp from the sea, yet a phantom warmth seemed to radiate from it, a heat born of memory. He began to inspect it, not as a man haunted by its image, but as a man who understood how things were built. He ran his fingers over the thick, rounded rim and the intricate weave of the bamboo strips. This was not a hasty or crude construction. There was a meticulousness to the work, a stubborn patience in every joint and every layer of waterproofing. Whoever had built this had poured countless hours into its creation. It was a work of devotion, and that realization sat uneasily with the violent chaos the boat represented in his mind. He peered over the side into the shallow interior. It was mostly empty, scoured clean by the waves, save for a few small objects nestled in a shallow pool of residual seawater. He knelt, his knees cracking in protest, and reached inside. His fingers first closed around something cold and metallic. He pulled it out. A Zippo lighter. The chrome was pitted and scarred by the salt, but the iconic shape was unmistakable. On one side was a faded, hand-engraved peace sign. It was a familiar totem from his era, a small act of defiance carried by countless soldiers. He flicked the striker wheel with his thumb out of pure habit. It scraped uselessly, its fire long dead. His fingers searched the bottom again and found a thin chain, rusted and brittle. He lifted it carefully, and from its end dangled a single rectangular piece of metal. A dog tag. He held it in his palm, its edges smoothed and rounded by time. He tilted it back and forth in the flat gray light, trying to decipher the name, the number, the blood type. But the letters had been worn away into silver ghosts, rendered illegible by years of rubbing against skin, or perhaps the relentless friction of the sea. All that was left was the shape, a silent testament to a soldier who, like him, had once been a number and a name. He held the two objects in his hand, a dead fire and a lost name. They were the relics of a brother, an unknown American soldier whose presence now felt as real and as heavy as the fog. He was so absorbed in these fragments of a forgotten life that he didn't immediately notice Shadow's strange behavior. He had assumed the dog was sitting patiently behind him, but a persistent low whine finally broke through his concentration. He turned his head. Shadow was not looking at him, nor at the Zippo or the dog tag. The German shepherd was standing by the boat's edge, his body rigid with focus. His nose was pressed against a dirty, canvas-covered object, lashed to the inner hull with thick, salt-stiffened rope. It was an old lifebuoy, the color faded to a pale, forgotten orange, stained with mildew and grime. It looked like a piece of useless jetsam, just another part of the strange vessel. But Shadow was transfixed. He nudged the lifebuoy insistently with his wet nose, then whined again, a higher, more urgent pitch this time. He looked back at Jacob, his eyes wide, then turned back to the ring and began to scratch at the canvas with his front paw, a soft but determined scraping sound. "Shadow, leave it," Jacob commanded quietly. The dog paused for a half-second, then ignored the command and scratched again, more forcefully this time. Jacob's brow furrowed. This was not simple curiosity. This was the same focused intensity Shadow displayed when he had cornered a raccoon under the cabin or found the scent of a deer on the trail. It was a signal, a declaration, "Look here." Trust in his dog was a foundational principle of Jacob's lonely world. He set the lighter and the dog tag carefully on the sand and moved to where Shadow stood. "What have you got, boy?" he murmured, resting a hand on the dog's back. He put his hands on the lifebuoy. The canvas was rough and stiff. He tried to shift it, but it was heavy, far heavier than an old waterlogged ring should be. He pushed on it, feeling its density. It was oddly rigid, not soft and pliant like he expected. Frowning, he began to work at the thick, brittle knots of the rope that held it in place. The fibers dug into his fingers, but finally, one knot came loose, then the other. He lifted the ring from the boat. It was shockingly heavy. He held it with both hands, a sense of discovery now warring with his dread. He gave it a shake. A distinct, solid thud came from within. Something was hidden inside. His heart began to beat a heavy, deliberate rhythm against his ribs. He carried the lifebuoy to a flat patch of sand and knelt before it. Shadow sat beside him, panting softly, his work done. Jacob pulled the small utility knife he always carried from his pocket and unfolded the blade. With a surgeon's care, he pierced the weathered canvas and sliced it open. The inside was not filled with the expected kapok or cork, but with a dense, crumbling foam. And nestled in the center, in a hollow carved out of the foam, was a small, olive-drab metal box. Jacob's breath hitched. He knew this box. He had carried one just like it 50 years ago. It was a military-issue container designed to be waterproof, shockproof, meant to protect sensitive documents or equipment. He reached into the opening, and his fingers brushed against the cold, familiar metal. He pulled it free. It was about the size of a thick book, sealed with 2 heavy-duty latches. He sat back on his heels, the box resting on his thighs. The weight of it felt immense, far more than its physical pounds. This was the heart of the mystery. The lighter and the dog tag were questions, but this box held the promise of an answer. With fingers that felt clumsy and numb, he worked the stiff latches. They sprang open with a sharp metallic click that sounded deafeningly loud in the quiet cove. He lifted the lid. Inside, resting on a bed of faded velvet, was a single object, a rectangular packet, sealed in thick, clear plastic. He could see the crisp folds of paper inside, covered in neat lines of handwriting. It was a letter, perfectly preserved, perfectly dry, waiting. He lifted it from the box. The plastic was cool and smooth to the touch. For a long moment, he just sat there on the cold sand, holding this impossible message delivered by the sea, the past resting literally in the palm of his hand. The world seemed to shrink until it was composed of only 3 things: the man, the dog, and the letter. The rhythmic sigh of the ocean faded to a distant murmur, and the thick gray fog became a featureless curtain, isolating Jacob in this moment of revelation. He sat on the cold sand, the vacuum-sealed packet resting in his hands. It felt both weightless and impossibly heavy. For a moment, he hesitated, a deep primal part of him wanting to hurl it into the surf, to let the ocean swallow its secrets and leave him to the hollow safety of his ignorance. But he couldn't. The journey of this message, its impossible arrival, had made him a part of its story. He was its intended recipient. With a deep, shuddering breath, he tore a corner of the thick plastic. The sound was sharp, violent in the stillness. He carefully slid the folded sheets of paper out. They were crisp and dry, covered in a neat, disciplined handwriting that spoke of a man accustomed to order. He unfolded the pages. The letter began without preamble, dated just over a year ago. To the brother who finds this, my name is Samuel T. Caldwell. I was a sergeant with the 196th Light Infantry Brigade. If you are reading this, it means the sea has been kinder to my final prayer than I ever deserved. It means this boat, this testament to my life's greatest regret, has found a shore. For that, I am grateful. Jacob's hands tightened on the page. The name meant nothing to him, but the unit designation was a gut punch. They had operated in the same regions, breathed the same humid air, fought the same unseen enemy. This was not a letter from a stranger. It was a letter from a ghost of his own past. He read on, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. I am writing this because I am nearing the end of my time, and a man cannot carry a secret like mine into the silence. He must offer it up, even if only to the wind and the waves. The secret is not about what I endured, it is about what I did. It happened in the spring of 1973 in Quang Ngai Province, on a tributary of the Tra Cuch River. Jacob's blood ran cold. He knew that river. He could almost smell the cloying scent of its muddy banks. We were on a patrol, acting on what we were told was solid intelligence. A Viet Cong supply movement was using the river at dawn. We set up an ambush position before the sun rose, hidden in the mangroves. We were tense, young, and running on too little sleep and too much fear. When we saw the boats, They looked exactly as they had been described, a small flotilla of them, moving silently on the dark water. They were basket boats, the kind the local villagers used for everything. The order was given, and we, being good soldiers, followed it. The noise was immense, a sudden brutal eruption in the quiet of the morning. It was over in minutes. When the silence returned, it was heavier, more profound than any silence I have ever known. As the light grew, we saw what we had done. There were no weapons, no enemy supplies. There were fishing nets, baskets of vegetables, and the scattered, floating belongings of people who were simply trying to get to a morning market. Jacob stopped reading. A wave of nausea washed over him, and he let the pages fall into his lap. He closed his eyes, but the images Samuel's words painted were already there, vivid and horrific. He saw it all, because he had seen versions of it himself. The terrible, irreversible moments born from the fog of war, from bad information, from the simple, terrifying act of following an order. He took several deep, ragged breaths, the cold air burning his lungs. Shadow, sensing his distress, moved closer, pressing his solid weight against Jacob's side. Grounded by the contact, Jacob picked up the letter again. The guilt from that day became the defining feature of my life. It followed me home from the war, a ghost that sat at my dinner table and stood by my bed at night. I tried to outrun it, to drown it, to ignore it. But it is a patient hunter. Decades passed. Finally, I understood I could not destroy the ghost. I could only try to make peace with it. And that is when I found the boat's purpose. I moved to the coast of Oregon and discovered a community of Vietnamese fishermen in a town called Astoria. They were refugees, people who had fled the very war that had broken me. I spent years with them. I learned to speak their language, not well, but enough. I earned their trust, and I asked them to teach me their craft. They taught me how to select and split the bamboo, how to weave it into this strange and beautiful shape, how to seal it with resin until it could float upon the water. They never knew why I was so obsessed. They did not know I was trying to rebuild the vessel that held my sin. Jacob stared at the boat, truly seeing it for the first time. The meticulous weave, the thick layers of resin. They were not just acts of construction. They were acts of penance. The sheer, monumental effort of it was staggering. It took me years to complete. When it was finished, I took it north, to a desolate stretch of the Washington coast. I put this letter inside it, along with a few pieces of my past, and pushed it out into the Pacific. I know the currents, I know the odds. I knew this was an act of foolish faith, but I set it adrift, entrusting it to fate. Wherever it stops, I prayed, that is where it was meant to be. It is my confession, my apology, my final attempt to make a thing of peace from an act of war. The words resonated with Jacob's own thoughts in the cove, confirming the feeling that had settled upon him. This was not an accident. This was a destination. I do not write this seeking forgiveness. The people I harmed are beyond my reach, and I am not worthy of it. I write this with a different hope. I hope that the man who finds this is a brother, a soldier, someone who knows the weight of a rifle, the burden of a command, the ghosts that follow us home when the fighting is done. If that man is you, then please understand. Understand that living with the decisions we made is the real war, the one that never ends. See this boat not as a relic of a conflict, but as a symbol of a long and painful search for atonement. That is all I can ask. If you understand that, then my ghost will not have drifted in vain. Samuel T. Caldwell, Sergeant, U.S. Army, retired. The letter ended there. Jacob let the final page rest in his lap. The paper was covered in words, but he felt as though he had just listened to a man's last confession, whispered across a vast and lonely ocean. The silence that returned to the cove was different now. It was no longer empty. It was filled with the life and pain of Samuel T. Caldwell. Jacob was no longer just a man haunted by his own past. He was now the keeper of another's. The knowledge settled on him, a crushing yet strangely intimate weight. He was not alone in his haunting. He had never been alone. Out there, somewhere, another soldier had carried the same invisible wounds, had fought the same silent, lifelong war. He carefully folded the letter and slid it back into its plastic sheath. He placed it gently into the metal box and closed the lid. The sharp click of the latches echoed in the stillness. Shadow rested his heavy head on Jacob's knee, his golden eyes full of a wisdom that needed no words. Jacob looked from the boat to the box to the endless gray sea that had carried this impossible burden right to his door. He did not know what he was going to do, but he knew he could not leave it here. This story was now his to carry. The walk back from the cove was a journey through a dream. Jacob moved automatically, his legs carrying him over the familiar terrain, but his mind was miles and decades away, trapped in the pages of the letter he clutched in the metal box. The oppressive gray fog seemed to have seeped inside him, blurring the edges of the world. Even Shadow seemed to sense the profound shift, walking so close that his fur brushed against Jacob's leg with every step, a constant physical reminder that he was not alone. Back in the cabin, the silence that had once been a comfort now felt heavy, charged with unspoken words. Jacob placed the olive-drab box on the center of his small wooden table. It sat there like an unexploded ordnance, a piece of a distant war that had finally found its target after 50 years. The entire room seemed to reorient itself around this single object. The neatly stacked books, the clean stove, the worn armchair, all the elements of his carefully constructed piece now seemed fragile and insignificant. He tried to resume his routine. He added a log to the fire, its hungry crackle doing little to warm the chill that had settled deep within him. He went to the kitchen to prepare his simple midday meal, but his hands felt clumsy, disconnected from his thoughts. He found himself staring at the wall, Samuel's words echoing in his mind. The order was given, and we, being good soldiers, followed it. That single sentence was a key turning a lock that had been rusted shut for half a century. He abandoned the pretense of normalcy and sat down at the table, the box before him. He took out the letter and read it again, and this time the words acted not as a story, but as a mirror. Samuel's confession was no longer just his own. It was a reflection of a memory Jacob had spent his entire adult life trying to bury. The walls of his cabin dissolved. The scent of wood smoke was replaced by the thick metallic smell of rain on hot dust. He was no longer a man in his late 50s, but a raw 21-year-old lieutenant in Thua Tien Hui Province, 1972. The memory he had walled off brick by painful brick came crashing down. It wasn't a firefight. There was no enemy to see, no bullets cracking past his ear. It was quieter, and somehow, worse. His platoon had been in the field for 3 weeks, exhausted, paranoid, running on grit and lukewarm coffee. The intelligence came down from command over the crackle of the radio. A suspected NVA mortar position nestled in a small valley. They were given the coordinates. He remembered staring at the map, a knot of unease tightening in his gut. The coordinates pointed to a cluster of huts, marked on his map as a farming hamlet, a place designated as a civilian zone. He had questioned it, his voice sounding young and uncertain over the radio. The response from the voice at headquarters was sharp, dismissive. The intelligence was solid. The target was confirmed. His orders were clear. An order, not a suggestion, not a debate. He was an officer. His purpose, his entire identity in that moment, was to follow orders, to protect his men. The mortars, if they were real, could rain death upon them at any moment. So he did his job. He relayed the coordinates to the artillery base miles away. He remembered the feeling of the radio handset, slick with sweat in his palm. He remembered the face of his radio man, a boy of 19 from Ohio, his eyes wide and trusting. He gave the command. There was a long, terrible silence. Then a distant, rolling thunder that was not thunder at all. It was the sound of the sky falling, of steel tearing through thatch and earth and lives. When it was over, the silence that returned was just like the one Samuel had described, heavier, deeper, and more awful than the noise it replaced. The follow-up report came 2 days later, a brief, sterile confirmation. The intelligence had been wrong, an error in translation from a local informant. It was a farming hamlet. There were no mortars. There were only families. Jacob gasped, the memory throwing him back into the present. He was in his chair, his knuckles white where he gripped the edge of the table. The cabin was cold. The fire had died down to embers. He felt a profound, aching kinship with the unknown Samuel. The circumstances were different, but the architecture of the guilt was identical. A moment of decision, a duty performed, a lifetime of consequence. For 50 years, he had carried that guilt in absolute solitude. He had believed his wound was unique, his failure a singular stain on his soul. The shame had been a wall between him and the rest of the world, isolating him completely. But now the wall had a window. Samuel's words had shown him that on the other side, another man had been living in an identical prison. The realization was a strange and painful paradox. The agony of his own memory, now dragged into the light, was sharper than ever. And yet, for the first time, the crushing weight of his loneliness lessened, just slightly. The burden was still his to carry, but he was no longer carrying it alone. Night fell. Jacob did not light the lamps. He sat in the encroaching darkness, the letter and the box on the table before him. He knew he would not sleep. The ghosts invited in by Samuel's confession were now walking freely through the rooms of his mind. He closed his eyes, and the images began to loop, the crackle of the radio, the distant thunder, the sterile words of the after-action report. He was drowning in it, the routine that had kept him afloat, now shattered and useless. He was falling into the blackness when he felt a sudden wet pressure on the back of his hand. He flinched, his eyes snapping open. Shadow stood beside his chair, his head resting on the armrest, his nose pressed to Jacob's skin. The dog made a low, guttural sound, a soft query from deep in his chest. His golden eyes, luminous in the dark, were fixed on Jacob's face. He whined again, then nudged Jacob's hand, a clear and simple message. I am here. I need you. The dog's needs were an unbreakable contract. Shadow had to be let out before they settled for the night. It was part of the routine, the one part Jacob had forgotten. This simple, biological imperative was the only thing that could have moved him. He pushed himself to his feet, his body stiff and sore, and walked to the door. He opened it, and the cold, clean night air rushed in, a welcome shock to his system. It smelled of the sea and the coming rain. He stepped out onto the small porch, Shadow padding silently beside him. The fog had cleared, and 1,000,000 stars were scattered across the black velvet sky, their light sharp and impossibly distant. Jacob looked up at the vast, silent cosmos, then down at the dog who stood faithfully by his side. Shadow was not concerned with the past or the future. His world was the here and now, the scent of a rabbit on the breeze, the reassuring presence of his human, the chill of the night air. In that moment, Jacob understood that the dog's loyalty was more than just companionship. It was his bridge to reality. Shadow's needs, for food, for water, for a walk, for a simple touch, were the threads that stitched Jacob's life together, preventing him from unraveling completely. He reached down and placed a hand on Shadow's broad head, his fingers sinking into the thick fur. The dog leaned into his touch, a silent exchange of comfort and gratitude. The nightmare of his memory was still there, waiting in the shadows of his mind. But it had receded. For now he was just a man standing under the stars with his dog, breathing in the cold night air. He was still broken, but Samuel's ghost and Shadow's loyalty had assured him of one profound, life-altering truth. He was not alone. Sleep did not come easily, but when dawn arrived, it brought not the familiar, weary dread, but a fragile, unfamiliar sense of purpose. Jacob rose from his bed, feeling as though a great weight had been settled upon his shoulders, yet in its acceptance, there was a strange kind of strength. The ghost of Samuel Caldwell and his own long-buried specters had spent the night in his cabin. But with the morning light, they were no longer just haunting him. They were asking something of him. He looked at the metal box on the table, its olive-drab surface seeming to absorb the pale morning light. Leaving the boat in the cove was not an option. To allow the tide to reclaim it, to let Samuel's final desperate act of penance be shattered and scattered by the indifferent Pacific, felt like a profound betrayal. That boat was no longer a random object. It was a memorial, a confession, a prayer made of bamboo and resin. He was its sole congregant, and he would not let it fall into ruin. He was now its keeper. The decision settled a calm over him. For the first time in years, his routine was not about avoidance, but about action. He pulled on his boots and went to the old shed behind his cabin, the salt-stiffened door groaning in protest. Inside, amidst the clutter of old fishing gear and woodworking tools, he found what he needed: a coil of thick, heavy rope, a block and tackle he hadn't used in a decade, and 2 heavy canvas tarps. His movements were methodical, driven by a clarity that had been absent from his life for so long. Shadow watched him, sensing the shift in the morning's energy. There was no aimless wandering, no quiet despair. There was a mission. When Jacob set off toward the cove, the dog trotted ahead, his tail held high, a scout leading the way for his commander. The physical reality of the task was far more difficult than Jacob had imagined. The basket boat, while not immensely heavy, was awkward and unwieldy. It had no clean lines, no easy points of leverage. Getting it out of the secluded cove and over the treacherous barrier of slick basalt rock was a brutal, exhausting struggle. He worked for hours, using the rope and tackle, his muscles screaming in protest. He would haul it a few feet, then brace it, his breath coming in ragged, painful bursts. The rough fibers of the rope cut into his hands, and the cold, damp air filled his lungs with an icy fire. Shadow was a constant, intuitive partner. He could not pull the weight, but when Jacob needed to secure a line, the dog would stand on the slack end of the rope, his weight helping to keep it from slipping. When Jacob paused, leaning against a rock to catch his breath, Shadow would press against his leg, a silent, encouraging presence. Man and dog, they worked as a single unit, locked in a grueling battle against gravity and terrain. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he maneuvered the boat past the last of the rocks and onto the open expanse of the main beach. He was now out in the open, his strange prize in full view. He felt a flicker of his old paranoia, a desire to be invisible, but it was quickly replaced by his resolve. He began the slow, arduous process of dragging the boat along the shoreline toward the path that led to his cabin. It was during this long, final leg of the journey that his isolation was broken. A figure emerged from the mist ahead, walking toward him. It was Mr. Henderson, one of the few other full-time residents on this lonely stretch of coast. Henderson was a fisherman in his 70s, a man whose face was a roadmap of wrinkles carved by sun and sea spray. He lived about a half-mile down the coast, and their interactions over the years had been limited to the occasional non-committal wave from their respective trucks. Henderson stopped a few yards away, his sharp blue eyes taking in the scene. Jacob, sweat-soaked and gasping for breath, the thick rope slung over his shoulder, and the utterly bizarre round boat trailing behind him. He pushed back his worn watch cap, revealing a fringe of white hair. "That's a strange catch, Jacob," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. There was no mockery in it, only a fisherman's plain-spoken curiosity. Jacob stopped, his chest heaving. He braced himself for questions he couldn't answer, for a judgment he didn't have the energy to deflect. "Found it," he managed to say, his voice hoarse. "Washed up in the North Cove?" Henderson walked a slow circle around the basket boat, his gaze expert and appraising. He ran a hand over the woven hull. "Vietnamese basket boat," he stated, not as a question, but as a fact. "Haven't seen one of these in the flesh since my time in the Navy. Never thought I'd see one on an Oregon beach." He looked at Jacob, a new understanding in his eyes. "You were over there, weren't you?" Jacob could only nod, his throat tight. Henderson stared at the boat for another long moment, then back at Jacob's exhausted face. He seemed to understand that this was more than just a piece of flotsam. "Well," he said finally, "some things take a long time to come ashore." He gestured with his chin. "Need a hand getting her up the bluff?" It was a simple, neighborly offer. A lifeline. The Jacob of a week ago would have refused it instantly, gruffly, protecting his solitude at all costs. But as he looked at the old fisherman's weathered, non-judgmental face, he felt a flicker of something new. He still couldn't share the story, not yet. But he didn't have to. The offer was enough. "I appreciate that, Henry," Jacob said, using the man's first name for the first time. "But I think this is something I have to do myself." Henderson nodded slowly, as if he understood perfectly. "All right then, you take care of it, and yourself." He gave a final respectful look at the boat, then turned and continued his walk down the beach, the mist closing in behind him. The brief conversation, the first real one he'd had in years, left Jacob feeling strangely exposed, but also, unexpectedly, a little less alone. Bolstered by the encounter, he bent his back to the task one last time, hauling the boat the final 100 yards to his property. He maneuvered it into a sheltered spot in his small yard, a place protected from the worst of the wind, where he could see it from his kitchen window. He stood there for a long time, his body aching with a profound, satisfying exhaustion, and looked at what he had done. He had brought the symbol home. The next morning, a new ritual began. After his coffee, he did not go for his long, aimless walk. Instead, he went out into the yard. He brought a bucket of fresh water and a soft cloth and began to gently, reverently, clean the salt and sand from the boat's hull. He worked slowly, his movements careful, as if he were tending to a sacred artifact. Each stroke of the cloth was an acknowledgement, an act of bearing witness to Samuel's story. He was no longer passively enduring his memories. He was actively engaging with them, tending to their physical form. In caring for this boat, he was beginning, in some small, fragile way, to care for the wounded soldier who still lived inside him. Shadow lay on the grass nearby, head on his paws, watching his master's new, quiet ceremony of healing begin. The days that followed settled into a new, solemn rhythm. Jacob's old routine, a shield built of monotonous tasks, had been replaced by a single, focused ritual: the care of the basket boat. Each morning after his coffee, he would go out into the yard. He would wipe the dew from its dark, resinous hull, check the ropes that secured its protective tarp, and simply stand beside it, a silent vigil. The boat was a constant physical presence, a focal point for the storm of memory and emotion that Samuel's letter had unleashed. But the ritual was not enough. Tending to the symbol only deepened the need to understand the story behind it. The name Quang Ngai echoed in his mind. He tried to picture it, to see the river Samuel had described, but all he could conjure were his own fragmented, feverish memories of a different province, a different landscape. He found himself rereading the letter every evening, his fingers tracing the neat, steady handwriting of a man who had been anything but steady on the inside. Who was Samuel T. Caldwell? What had his life been like after he laid down his penance and sent it out to sea? The questions gnawed at him. They were a hunger that his quiet, isolated life could not satisfy. He realized, with a sense of rising dread, that the answers were not in his cabin, not on his beach, and not within the confines of his own fractured memory. The answers were out there, in the world he had so painstakingly shut out. After a week of this internal struggle, he woke one morning and knew he could not endure the not knowing any longer. He made a decision, one that felt as momentous and terrifying as stepping out of a helicopter into a hot landing zone. He was going to drive into town. He was going to the library. He stood at the door, his keys in his hand, a strange and unfamiliar anxiety churning in his stomach. Shadow stood beside him, whining softly, sensing the disruption in the established order. Jacob knelt and put a hand on the dog's head. "You have to stay here, boy," he said, his voice quiet. "Guard the house. Guard the boat." Shadow looked from Jacob to the basket boat in the yard, then back to Jacob, and seemed to understand. He sat, his posture alert, a sentry assuming his post. For Jacob, leaving the dog behind felt like leaving his anchor. He would have to navigate the currents of the outside world on his own. The drive into the coastal town of Port Blossom was an assault on his senses. After years of a world composed of wind, waves, and the cry of gulls, the noise felt overwhelming. Cars rushed past, radios played from open windows, and people moved with a speed and purpose that felt alien to him. He kept his knuckles white on the steering wheel of his old, rusted truck, his focus narrowed to the road ahead. He felt exposed, a ghost from another era drifting through a world that had moved on without him. He parked in front of the small, single-story brick building that housed the Port Blossom Public Library. He hadn't set foot inside it in at least 15 years. He sat in his truck for a long time, just watching people come and go, trying to gather the courage to join them. Finally, steeling himself, he got out and walked up the steps. The library was an oasis of quiet, but it was a populated quiet. The air smelled of old paper, binding glue, and lemon-scented floor polish. A few patrons browsed the shelves, and a mother read a picture book to her child in a corner. Every rustle of a page, every soft cough, seemed amplified to Jacob's ears. He felt like an intruder, his boots heavy and loud on the linoleum floor. He kept his head down, avoiding eye contact, and made his way to the back, to the small section marked History. He found the shelf on the Vietnam War. He pulled out several books, his hands clumsy. He sat at an empty carrel in the corner and opened them. They were filled with familiar images, maps crisscrossed with arrows, and dry academic text about strategy and policy. He scanned the pages, looking for the name Quang Ngai. He found it on a map, a small dot on a coastal plain. He stared at it, but it gave him nothing. These books were about the war, but they were not about the people. They couldn't tell him what he needed to know. They couldn't explain the weight of a man's soul. A deep sense of frustration and hopelessness began to set in. This had been a mistake. He was about to gather the books and leave when he looked up toward the main circulation desk. Behind it sat a woman who seemed as much a part of the library as the books themselves. She was the librarian, Eleanor Vance. She was in her late 60s with soft gray hair tied in a neat bun and kind, intelligent eyes magnified by a pair of reading glasses. In the decades Jacob had lived nearby, she had always been there, a gentle, constant presence in the town. This was the highest hurdle, to ask for help. It went against every instinct he had honed for years. But the need to know was stronger than the need to hide. He stood up, his chair scraping loudly in the silence, and walked slowly toward the desk. Eleanor looked up from her computer as he approached, a polite, welcoming smile on her face. "Can I help you find something?" she asked, her voice soft. Jacob's own voice felt like rust in his throat. He cleared it. "I'm looking for books about Vietnam." He gestured vaguely back toward the history section. "The ones you have are not quite right." Eleanor's smile remained, but her eyes grew more perceptive. She studied his face for a moment, seeing not just a man looking for a book, but something deeper, the familiar, haunted look she had seen in the eyes of other men from his generation. "I see," she said gently. "Are you looking for something specific?" History books can be very broad. Sometimes the personal accounts are more what people are looking for. Her perceptiveness disarmed him. "Yes," he said, the word coming out with a rush of air. "Stories. From soldiers." He couldn't bring himself to say the word veteran. She nodded, her expression full of a quiet, respectful understanding. She didn't pry or ask for details. Instead, she seemed to come to a decision. "The books we have are limited," she said, her voice lowering slightly, becoming more personal. "But there is another resource. It's not something I can give you from a shelf." She took a notepad and a pen from a holder on her desk. "There is an online archive. It's called The Keepsake Project. Chat." She wrote the name down in neat, clear script. "It's a website, a very reputable one, started by historians and veterans' families," she explained. "It's a place where veterans can share their stories. Some write about their experiences, others post photographs, or tell the story of a specific object they brought home. It's a way for them to preserve their history in their own words. Some do it anonymously, others use their names." She pushed the small slip of paper across the counter to him. "It's a vast collection. It can be difficult to navigate, but it's a place of great honesty. If you are looking for answers, real answers, that might be a place to start." Jacob stared at the piece of paper. The Keepsake Project. The words seemed to hold an immense promise and an immense terror. He took the paper, his rough fingers closing around it. "Thank you," he managed to whisper. "You're very welcome," Eleanor said, her kind eyes holding his for a moment before she returned to her work, giving him the privacy of a graceful exit. He turned and walked out of the library, the bell over the door chiming softly behind him. He got back into his truck and sat there, the slip of paper resting in his palm. He had faced the world, and it had not broken him. Instead, it had offered him a map. A new, uncertain, and daunting path lay ahead, but for the first time in a very long time, it was a path that led forward, not in circles. The slip of paper with the website address felt like both a key and a burden in Jacob's pocket. For 2 days, he did not go back to town. He stayed within the safe confines of his property, tending to the basket boat, walking the misty shore with Shadow, and wrestling with a new kind of fear. The library had been a formidable wall to breach, but it was a quiet, physical space. The internet, as he understood it, was a different beast entirely. It was a gateway to a world of noise, chaos, and endless information, everything he had spent his life trying to escape. But the need to understand Samuel's story had become a relentless driving force. It was no longer enough to be the keeper of the man's boat. He felt a profound responsibility to be the keeper of his memory, and for that, he needed to know more. On the third morning, with a sense of grim determination, he left Shadow on guard and drove his old truck back to the Port Blossom Public Library. The building was just as quiet. The air still smelled of paper and polish, but his mission today felt infinitely more daunting. He nodded stiffly at Eleanor Vance, who gave him a small, encouraging smile from behind the desk, then walked to the same row of public computers he had seen on his first visit. He chose one at the very end, its back to the rest of the room, and sat down. The machine hummed quietly, its screen a bright, blank void. He stared at it, feeling a profound sense of alienation. His hands, calloused and capable, accustomed to the tangible resistance of wood, rope, and steel, felt clumsy and useless as he rested them on the plastic keyboard. The mouse felt like a fragile, weightless toy under his palm. He had never owned a computer, had never felt the need. His life was analog, measured in seasons and tides, not megabytes and bandwidth. He managed to turn the machine on, but the screen that appeared was a confusing constellation of icons and windows. After several minutes of fruitless clicking, a wave of frustration and shame washed over him. He was a man who had navigated triple canopy jungle by compass and starlight, but he was completely lost in this simple, digital world. Swallowing his pride, he walked back to the main desk. "Excuse me," he said, his voice low. "I need help getting to a website." Eleanor's smile was kind, betraying no judgment. She walked him back to the computer, and with a few swift, practiced clicks, she opened the web browser. "You just type the address right in this bar at the top," she said gently, pointing to the screen. She then retreated, leaving him to his task. With one finger, like a man defusing a bomb, Jacob painstakingly typed out the address from the slip of paper. He hit the Enter key, and the screen flickered, then resolved into the homepage of the Keepsake project. The design was simple, somber, and deeply respectful. The background was a muted gray, the text a simple, clean black. The main image was a stark black and white photograph of a pair of worn combat boots, their laces undone, resting on a wooden floor. There were no flashing advertisements, no distracting videos. It felt less like a website and more like the entrance to a memorial. He slowly navigated the site, his movements with the mouse becoming slightly less awkward. He saw the main sections Eleanor had mentioned: oral histories, submitted photos, objects and their stories. He clicked on the last one, his heart pounding, wondering if he might see a picture of a basket boat. But the page was filled with hundreds of entries: a tattered letter from home, a child's drawing, a dented canteen. Each object was a hyperlink to a story. The sheer volume of memory stored here was overwhelming. He felt like he was standing at the edge of an ocean of pain, unsure of how to even begin his search for Samuel. Then he saw a tab at the top of the page labeled Community Forums. He clicked it. A list of discussion groups appeared with titles like Finding Your Unit and Coping with PTSD. And near the bottom of the list, one title seemed to leap off the screen, grabbing his attention with an almost physical force: Moral Injury, Carrying the Weight. He had never seen the term moral injury before, but he understood it instantly on a cellular level. It was the perfect description for the nameless wound he and Samuel both carried. It wasn't about what had been done to them, but what they had done. It was the injury to the soul. With a trembling hand, he clicked the link. He had entered a different kind of space now. It was a simple text-based forum, a series of posts from anonymous users. The screen was a wall of words, a collection of confessions whispered into the digital void. He began to read. The first post was from a user named Echo73. "I was 18. We were sweeping a village. A woman ran from a hut. My CO yelled that she had a weapon. I saw a dark shape in her hands. I fired. It was a baby wrapped in a black blanket. I have seen her face every single night for 49 years. Jacob felt the air leave his lungs. He scrolled down. Another post from Doc Charlie Coe. Triage. You learn the word in training, but you don't know what it means until you have 2 men bleeding out and only enough bandages for one. I made a choice. The man I chose lived. I go to his family reunion every year. But the face of the boy I left behind, I see him more often. His own hands were shaking now. He scrolled again, his eyes scanning the screen, a litany of pain and regret. Then he found a post that made him stop breathing altogether. It was from River Rat 1972. We were told the village was hostile, that they were storing weapons for the VC. We called in artillery. We leveled it. We went in afterwards. There were no weapons, just huts and toys and silence. An old man came out of the ruins, just staring at us. He didn't scream or cry. He just looked at us. And I knew in that moment that I was the monster. How do you live with being the monster in someone else's story? Jacob pushed his chair back, a choked sound escaping his throat. He felt as if he had been struck. These were not stories. They were his own thoughts, his own nightmares, his own unspeakable truths written by strangers. The shame he had carried as a unique and monstrous burden was here, multiplied, shared by dozens of unseen, unknown men. The experience was terrifying. It was like looking into a mirror and seeing 100 broken faces staring back. To know that his private agony was not private at all was a horrifying revelation. But beneath the terror, a new and unfamiliar feeling began to surface, a profound, soul-deep wave of relief. He was not an anomaly. He was not a lone monster. He was a soldier, and this crushing weight of a decision made in a moment of fear and confusion was a common wound of war. For 50 years, his guilt had been a wall of ice, isolating him from all of humanity. But reading these words, he felt the first crack appear in that ice. He sat there in front of the humming computer, in the quiet of the small-town library, and wept. He cried for the boy he had been, for the man Samuel had been, and for all the anonymous brothers on the screen who were still fighting the real war, the one that followed them home. He had not found Samuel Caldwell yet, but he had found his tribe. And in the shared darkness of their confessions, for the first time in his life, he no longer felt completely and utterly alone. Returning to the library the next day felt different. The anxiety that had plagued Jacob during his first 2 visits was gone, replaced by a quiet, focused determination. He no longer felt like an intruder in this world of books and screens. He felt like a man on a vital mission. He sat at the same computer terminal at the end of the row, a space that was beginning to feel strangely familiar. The machine hummed to life under his touch, no longer a source of intimidation, but a tool, a conduit to the past. He navigated back to the Keepsake Project website, his movements with the mouse now steady and sure. The forum of anonymous confessions had given him solace, the profound comfort of shared experience. But now he needed more. He needed to find the man who had started it all. At the top of the homepage was a search bar. He took a deep breath and typed in the name from the letter. Samuel T. Caldwell. He hit enter. The screen refreshed, showing a single heartbreaking message. No results found. A cold knot of disappointment tightened in his stomach. He tried again, this time with just Samuel Caldwell. Hundreds of results appeared, articles, photos, forum posts from men who had known a Samuel or a Caldwell. It was an impossible forest of names and memories. He felt a flicker of the old hopelessness. How could he find one specific ghost in a graveyard so vast? He leaned back, closing his eyes, thinking. He remembered Samuel's letter, the specific details. He sat forward again and typed a new set of search terms into the box. Basket boat, Kwanglangai, 196th Infantry. He hit enter. The screen flickered, and there it was. A single result. It was not a forum post. It was an article, listed under the section Objects and Their Stories. The title was simple and poignant. My Father's Final Prayer, the Story of a Basket Boat. Below the title was a submitter's name, Sarah Caldwell. Jacob's heart hammered against his ribs. He clicked the link. The page that loaded was a memorial, a tribute written by a daughter to honor her father, who had passed away just over a year ago. It was accompanied by a single, faded photograph from the 1970s of a young, serious-looking soldier with kind eyes. Samuel. Jacob began to read, and the final pieces of the story fell into place. Sarah wrote of a father she loved deeply, but who had always seemed distant, a man who carried a quiet, unspoken sadness. He had worked a simple, steady job as a carpenter, lived in a modest house, and rarely spoke of his time in the war. But after his death, while going through his papers, she had discovered his life's secret. For over 30 years, Samuel Caldwell had been running a small, anonymous charitable foundation. Using the majority of his modest pension and savings, he had spent 3 decades funding projects in a place he had never returned to, Quang Ngai Province, Vietnam. He had financed the construction of 2 small elementary schools and, in his final years, a rural medical clinic. The article included recent photographs. One showed a simple, clean, one-story building with a sign over the door that read, in both Vietnamese and English, "The Friendship Clinic." Another showed a group of smiling Vietnamese children in school uniforms, waving at the camera from the steps of a building with the name Hope and Renewal School painted above the entrance. Jacob stared at the images, his vision blurring. This was the other side of Samuel's penance. The boat was the symbolic act, the release of a ghost. But this was the real work. This was the tangible, constructive counterbalance to the destruction he had caused. He hadn't just stewed in his guilt, he had spent a lifetime quietly, patiently, building something good in the very place he had broken. It was an act of atonement so profound, so dedicated, that it left Jacob breathless. At the bottom of the article, there was one last entry. The text from Sarah read, "Shortly before he passed, my father, knowing his time was short, asked me to record a message. He said it was for the boat. I didn't fully understand, but I did as he asked. He wanted his story attached to his final prayer." Below the text was an embedded video player. Jacob felt a tremor run through his hands. This was it, the final piece, to see him, to hear his voice. He realized he didn't have headphones. He stood up and almost ran from the library, his heart pounding. He fumbled in the glove compartment of his truck until he found an old, tangled pair of earbuds. He rushed back inside, plugged them into the computer, and with a deep breath, clicked the play button. The video was shaky, clearly filmed by an amateur hand in what looked like a dusty workshop. Then a man came into frame and sat on a simple wooden stool. It was Samuel. He was in his late 70s, thin and frail, his hair white and wispy. But his eyes, the same kind eyes from the old photograph, were clear and lucid, though they held a weariness that seemed to run deeper than bone. The basket boat, the very one that now sat in Jacob's yard, was visible just behind him. Samuel looked directly into the camera, as if he were looking right at Jacob. When he spoke, his voice was thin but steady, filled with a quiet gravity. "If you are seeing this," Samuel began, "it means my boat found a harbor. I hope it did. It has carried its burden long enough." He paused, gathering his strength. "A long time ago, in a place very far from here, I was part of an act of terrible violence. I have lived with the memory of it every day since, the sound, the silence after. It never leaves you. A man can't undo what is done. The past is a stubborn, immovable thing." He gestured behind him at the boat. "I built this with my own hands. I wanted to create the very thing that haunted me. I wanted to see if my hands, which once took part in destruction, could still create something whole. It has been my penance, my meditation, my long apology." He looked down at his own hands, then back at the camera. "But a man can't carry his ghosts forever. It's time to let it go. I am sending this boat out to the sea as my final prayer. It carries all the regret, all the sorrow, all the apologies I could never speak. I am sending it out in the hope that it might find someone who understands, and in the hope that the souls of the people on that river, so long ago, might find some measure of peace. And that, finally, I might find some too." He gave a small, weary smile. "It's just a boat, but maybe it's also a bridge to a shore I can't see. Thank you." The screen went black. Jacob sat motionless in the library carrel, the headphones still in his ears, tears streaming down his face. The abstract ghost now had a face. The silent confession now had a voice. The full, heartbreaking, and beautiful arc of Samuel Caldwell's life was complete. And in that moment, something inside Jacob finally, truly let go. A profound sense of release washed over him, a feeling of grace that he had not felt since he was a boy. He understood. He finally understood. You could not erase the past. You could not unfire the shells. You could not bring back the dead. But you could choose what you did with the time that was left. You could counterbalance the weight. You could build schools. You could fund clinics. You could turn a symbol of your life's greatest regret into a final hopeful prayer. Action could bring peace, even when memory could not. He slowly took off the headphones and wiped his face with the back of his hand. He felt empty, but it was a clean, quiet emptiness, not the jagged, hollow ache he was used to. He had the complete story now. He knew what Samuel had done, and he knew why. And in understanding Samuel's journey to atonement, he could finally, at long last, begin to see a path for his own. He stood up and walked out of the library, leaving the darkness of the room behind him as he stepped into the bright, clear light of the afternoon sun. Jacob returned from the library a changed man. He moved with a quiet purpose, the frantic, haunted energy that had propelled him for days, having settled into a deep, foundational calm. When he got back to the cabin, the first thing he did was walk out to the yard. He stood before the basket boat, but he no longer saw it as a symbol of guilt or a relic of war. He saw it as a testament to a life, a monument to a man's long, arduous journey toward peace. Samuel had completed his work. Now Jacob had to begin his. That night he sat at his kitchen table with a pen and a blank notebook. For a man who had not spoken of his past in 50 years, the thought of writing it down was daunting. But he was not just writing for himself. He was writing for Samuel. He had to bear witness. The words came slowly at first, painfully. He wrote about the silence of his life and the impossible arrival of the boat in the fog. He described finding the letter and the crushing yet clarifying weight of Samuel's confession. Then came the hardest part. He wrote of his own memory, the one he had shared with no one. He wrote of the coordinates, the radio call, and the rolling thunder that was not thunder. He wrote of the guilt that had been his only companion for half a century. He wrote all through the night, the only sound the scratching of his pen and the soft breathing of Shadow asleep at his feet. When he was done, he typed it all out, a slow, deliberate process on the library computer the next day. He titled his story, The Keeper of the Boat, and submitted it, along with a photo he had taken of the strange craft resting in his yard, to the Keepsake Project. As he clicked the submit button, he felt as though he were setting his own prayer adrift on a digital sea, releasing it to a fate he could not control. While he waited, he worked. The area around the basket boat became his new focus. He dug up the stubborn coastal weeds, built a simple, low border of bleached driftwood, and planted sea thrift and wild lavender, hardy plants that could survive the salt and the wind. He placed a simple wooden bench a few feet away. Slowly, the patch of ground was transformed from a simple yard into a small, quiet garden, a place for contemplation. The boat was its heart, a shrine not to war, but to the long, difficult search for peace that follows. A few weeks later, an email arrived. His story had been reviewed and published. He felt a strange mix of terror and relief. His most private pain was now public, a part of the vast, shared history of the war. For a while, nothing changed. Life continued in its new rhythm. He tended his garden, he walked the beach with Shadow, and he sat on the bench looking at the boat. The memories still came, but they were different now. They were no longer ghosts that ambushed him in the dark. They were stories he had acknowledged, stories that now had a place. Then, one crisp autumn afternoon, a dusty blue pickup truck he didn't recognize pulled slowly into his gravel driveway. An older man got out. He was stout with a slight limp and wore a faded cap with a VFW logo on it. He stood for a moment, looking from the cabin to the boat in the garden, his expression hesitant, almost shy. Jacob felt a flicker of his old instinct to retreat, to go inside and lock the door. But it was fleeting. He stood up from his porch steps and gave a small nod. The man walked slowly toward him. "Are you Jacob?" he asked, his voice a little rough. "I am." "My name's Dan," the man said, extending a hand. Jacob shook it. The grip was firm. I read your story on the Keepsake site. I live over in Tillamook. I had to come see the boat." Jacob looked at the man. He saw the same weariness in his eyes that he had seen in Samuel's video, the same weariness he knew was in his own. "It's right here," Jacob said simply. He led Dan to the small garden. They stood in silence for a long time, just looking at the strange, round craft. The afternoon sun cast long shadows, and the scent of lavender mixed with the salt from the sea. "He really built it himself," Dan said, his voice full of wonder. "He did," Jacob confirmed. Jacob gestured to the bench. "Have a seat if you like." They sat side by side, two old soldiers in the quiet of the afternoon. Shadow, who had been watching from the porch, came over and lay down at Jacob's feet with a soft sigh, resting his head on his paws. For a long time, neither man spoke. It was not an awkward silence, but a shared one, full of everything that did not need to be said. Then Dan, his eyes fixed on the boat, began to talk. "I was in the Delta," he began, his voice low. "Different river, different year. We were on a patrol boat. There was a kid, a little boy, on the riverbank. He was waving at us, and one of the new guys, he got spooked. He thought the kid was a spotter. He thought—" Dan's voice broke. He stopped, shaking his head, unable to continue. Jacob did not speak. He did not offer empty platitudes or say that he understood. He simply sat there, his presence a steady, quiet anchor. He listened. He listened to the words Dan couldn't say, to the grief and the guilt that hung in the air between them. He listened as a keeper, as a brother. The sun sank lower, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. The sound of the waves rolling onto the shore was a gentle, timeless rhythm. Jacob looked at the man beside him, then at the boat Samuel had built, then at the faithful gray dog resting peacefully at his feet. A profound, unshakable peace settled over him. He had spent 50 years believing that peace could only be found in absolute silence, in the total isolation from a world that could not possibly understand. But he had been wrong. The peace was not in the silence of being alone. It was here, in the shared silence of listening. It was in the quiet connection between two old soldiers and in the unspoken loyalty of the animal who had guided him out of the fog. Samuel's boat had not been an ending. It was a beginning. Its impossible journey had delivered more than just a letter. It had delivered a legacy. And now it was Jacob's to continue, one story, one shared silence at a time. He rested a hand on Shadow's warm, soft fur, and for the first time in his life, he felt truly, completely at home. Perhaps the greatest journeys are not across oceans, but across the silent spaces that keep our hearts apart. A loyal companion and a shared story can build the bridges that guide us back to peace, reminding us that no burden is too heavy when we carry it together. If this story found a place in your heart, we invite you to keep these tales alive by subscribing to our channel. We would be honored to read your thoughts in the comments below. And the next story is ready to begin. Simply click on the video now, appearing on your screen to continue the journey with us.